This is NBC Nightly News, Wednesday, March 20th, reported by John Chancellor.
Good evening. Chet Huntley, who was an anchorman on this program for 14 years, died today in Montana. The cause of death was cancer. He was 62 years old. We'll have a full report on Chet's death and his life later in the program. And the news today is that in London, a gunman tried to assassinate Princess Anne of Britain and her husband of 5 months, Captain Mark Phillips. The assassin repeatedly fired into their car as the couple was being driven to Buckingham Palace. The princess and her husband were not harmed. We have a report on this from London by satellite.
Princess Anne and her husband were driving down the Mall, returning to Buckingham Palace this evening, when a car cut in front of their car and forced it to stop. A gunman got out and started shooting at the royal car, a Rolls-Royce. He hit and wounded the princess's chauffeur, as well as a security man who was also in the front seat. A policeman on the sidewalk was also hit and wounded, as was a passerby. But neither the princess nor her husband, Mark Phillips, was hit, and the gunman was later caught. Tonight, hundreds of police cordoned off the entire area and began questioning people who may have witnessed the attack. The princess and her husband had been to a reception earlier in the evening. It was about 8 p.m. London time when they were returning to the palace, and the shooting began. At first, it was believed the attack was an assassination attempt, but now the police believe it may have been an effort to kidnap the princess, and that may be why she and her husband were not shot. No reason has been given for the attack this evening, and despite all the violence associated with the problem in Northern Ireland, there is no indication that that was behind the event. But whatever the reason, the attack has not only shaken Princess Anne and her husband, according to a palace statement, it has also shaken all of Britain. Garrett Gutley, NBC News, in London.
A palace spokesman said the young couple were returning from a private showing of a documentary film about horsemanship in which both of them appeared. We'll be back with the rest of tonight's news after this. In Washington, John Rhodes, the Republican leader of the House, today urged the Judiciary Committee to narrow the inquiry into the impeachment of President Nixon. Rhodes suggested a compromise to the committee. He urged that it define what Rhodes called the specific areas of presidential activity that is of interest. The committee has asked the president for 42 tapes in addition to those promised by the White House and many more documents. And today it was revealed for the first time that the president himself is going over the material requested by the committee. This came out at a meeting of the committee, and Ray Scherer was there.
The disclosure came as Counsel Dorr told the committee that White House lawyer St. Clair wanted the request for additional material to be specific and narrow.
The basis for this request was that it was an arduous job for the president to listen to these recordings. It was an arduous job for the people at the White House to locate that part of a particular tape where the conversation did take place.
Is there really a question in your mind that Mr. St. Clair does not understand what we want in terms of those conversations?
Well, I think that after our meeting Monday, Mr. St. Clair understood perfectly what we wanted. And we haven't had a reply from Mr. St. Clair since that date.
But didn't we have a reply from the president, who spoke and said to the nation that he would not turn over anything more to the committee? Is that not a reply from the client? Do we need a reply from his attorney when the client is speaking publicly as to what he will deliver us?
My recommendation is that this committee should be leave no doubt in the mind of any member of the American people that first of all there is no misunderstanding about what the committee wants and why it wants it.
The committee meets again tomorrow to take up the partisan row that is brewing over the role presidential lawyer St. Clair should play in future committee sessions, whether he should be there to cross-examine witnesses. While Democrats and Republicans disagree on that, they are still in agreement on the central issue. The president must turn over the additional tapes the committee wants. Ray Scherer, NBC News at the Capitol.
John Wilson, the lawyer for H.R. Haldeman, one of the Watergate cover-up defendants, today asked federal judge John Sirica not to give the House Judiciary Committee a secret grand jury report in which President Nixon is prominently mentioned. Judge Sirica said the committee was entitled to the report, whereupon Haldeman's attorney went to the United States Court of Appeals. Arguments on the appeal will be heard tomorrow. Bebe Rebozo, President Nixon's close friend, testified behind closed doors today before the Senate Watergate Committee. Rebozo already has testified that he received a $100,000 campaign contribution from Howard Hughes, that he kept it in a safe deposit box at the Florida bank he owns and returned it 3 years later. Today, Rebozo made his way into the committee room without saying a word to reporters, and he said nothing to them when he left. President Nixon stayed over in Houston today after his session last night with the National Association of Broadcasters. The president took an early morning walk, and he stopped in a drugstore for a cup of coffee. Then Mr. Nixon had breakfast with some Texas businessmen and Republican leaders and was formally introduced to them by John Connally. After that, Mr. Nixon went to the Johnson Space Center, and there, among other things, he presented medals to the Skylab 3 astronauts. George Lewis covered the story.
It was the president's third visit to the Space Center. This time, he examined the preparations for the first joint U.S.-Soviet mission scheduled for July of 1975. The astronauts involved in the project briefed the president. Then they inspected the mock-ups of the space vehicles that will be flown during the mission. The goals of the joint effort are at least as political as they are scientific, a chance to prove Americans and Russians can work together. White House interest in the Russian mission is important to Space Center employees who are concerned about cutbacks in the space program. Mr. Nixon stressed the importance of their work with the Russians.
I do not mean that simply because we are going to have this joint project with the Soviet Union in the field of space that the differences between our two systems will change, or that the differences that we have in various parts of the world where our interests will evaporate. But I do know that the Russian people are a great people. The American people are a great people. And we can be so much together. And when we can work together, let's work together. That's what this program is about.
The crowd of 5,000 Space Center employees and their families gave the president a friendly reception, and he spent about 10 minutes shaking hands before he went to the airport for the return trip to Washington. George Lewis, NBC News, Houston.
Whatever the president's private thoughts today, his public behavior was that of a man undisturbed. There was that cup of coffee in the drugstore, and he shook hands with people on the street, and he acted like a man who had anything but Watergate on his mind. Baltimore County Executive Dale Anderson was found guilty today of 32 charges of income tax evasion and accepting kickbacks from Maryland contractors. Anderson, a Democrat, succeeded Spiro Agnew as county executive, and both the prosecution and the defense at Anderson's trial said he inherited a system of corruption from Agnew. A former chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, William Casey, testified today at the New York trial of former cabinet members John Mitchell and Maurice Stans. Robert Hager reports.
As chairman of the agency that was investigating financier Robert Vesco, William Casey presumably was in a key position to feel pressure if pressure were brought on Vesco's behalf. Casey testified that he had lots of telephone calls about the case, 4 calls from former White House counsel John Dean, 2 calls from John Mitchell, 1 session over drinks at Mitchell's apartment. But Casey said most of these were just inquiries, and he was unwilling to say anyone ever asked anything improper. About the only action he said he was ever asked to take was to put off an SEC interrogation for a week until after the 1972 election. Casey said this was to avoid disclosures that could lead to a possible campaign smear. Otherwise, Casey had frequent lapses of memory, and his testimony was not critical of the defendants. Casey is still important in the Nixon administration, still friends with Mitchell and Stans, and in today's testimony, he left the impression that no one in Washington did anything very far out of the ordinary on Vesco's behalf. If William Casey was not a particularly damaging witness to the defense in this case, there's some feeling around here that John Dean may be more inclined to be talkative from the witness stand. Dean could testify in this case tomorrow. Robert Hager, NBC News, New York.
The Department of Justice today accused the entire trucking industry and the Teamsters and other drivers' unions with discriminating against blacks and Spanish people Spanish-speaking people in hiring. The major defendants in this civil rights lawsuit immediately agreed to hire more minority group employees. The government reported today that the personal income of Americans went up $6.6 billion in February over January. And the government reported a surplus in the United States balance of international payments of more than $1 billion last year. It's the first yearly surplus since the government began keeping records on that in 1960. On Wall Street, the Dow Jones Industrials went up almost 5 points. Average share prices went up on the New York Exchange and down on the American. Trading was light. For the 9th straight day, Syrian forces shelled Israeli positions on the Golan Heights front in the Middle East. Syria said it had destroyed a number of Israeli tanks and half-tracks, but Israel denied that and said its forces hadn't even bothered to return the Syrian artillery fire. In Indianapolis today, a man with a knife took a woman hostage at the airport and told her to demand $1 million and a commercial plane. Instead, she telephoned airport security police. They shot and wounded the alleged extortionist, who's been identified as Dennis Tillman of Detroit. The woman, whose name is Rebecca Dotlick, suffered a slight cut on the neck. In San Diego, California today, a woman rejoined her husband and children after an absence of 3 months. For the woman, Carmen Barrientos, it was the happy ending of a long ordeal. For her husband and children, it was a time of joy, a new beginning which she would share.
These children are waiting to see their mother. When Carmen Barrientos left her family before Christmas, she was totally blind. She lost her vision 8 years ago because of diabetes. Today, following a surgery in San Francisco, her sight was restored in one eye, and she made her own way off the plane to a tearful reunion with her family. It was the first time she had ever seen her 7-year-old son, Martin, and his 3-year-old sister, Zokiel. In December of last year, the Barrientos came to the attention of the Flying Samaritans, a group of American doctors who fly into Mexico giving medical help to the people there. It was this anonymous group who arranged for Mrs. Barrientos' trip to the hospital in San Francisco for the 2 necessary operations. Mrs. Barrientos' vision is not perfect yet. Her doctors believe, however, that it won't be too long before it's normal once again. Larry Boyer, KGTV News, in San Diego.
People throughout the news business and throughout the country were saddened today by the news of the death of Chet Huntley, who died early this morning of cancer at his home in Big Sky, Montana. Chet was 62 when he died. He's survived by his mother, his widow, 2 daughters from his first marriage, and 4 grandchildren. The funeral services will be private. Chet began as a newspaper man and in a long career in broadcasting, worked for all 3 networks. He was with NBC from 1955 until his retirement in 1970. When he left New York, he retired to his home state, Montana. NBC gave him a horse, which he named Julian Goodman. Mr. Julian Goodman is the president of NBC. Chet loved Montana and the resort he was helping to build at a place called Big Sky. He used to come back to New York occasionally, but only for a visit. This was his real home, in these mountains, and we think that showed in his character. During his broadcasting career, Chet Huntley won 4 Peabody Awards and 2 Overseas Press Club Awards. He and his partner of many years on the Huntley-Brinkley Report won the Distinguished Service Award of the National Association of Broadcasters, and the news program on which Chet and David appeared for so long with so much success won every major television award, including 7 Emmys. And here's what David Brinkley said today.
One night, years ago, after one of the all-night sessions at a political convention, when Chet and I were tired out, and so were a lot of the American people who had stayed up all night with us. Chet said to me, "Sometime I'll be glad to get out of this and get back out west and sit on my own front porch and look out across the range over maybe a mile or so of my own land and see some of my own cattle standing out there in the sunshine." Well, when he left our news program about 3 years ago, he got to do a little of that in Montana. I'm sorry he didn't get to do more of it. But in these last months in Montana, he had quite a lot to think about. Most pleasant to think about certainly was that whenever, wherever we traveled around this country, we always ran into younger people, college age and thereabouts, who said to us, "You know, I grew up with you guys. You were a part of my youth, a part of my education, and a part of my life." Well, he certainly was touched and moved and affected by that. And he had that to think about, and the knowledge that he always told them the truth, as far as he knew it. Well, over these years, with the work and the help of many others at NBC who were not so often seen and not so well known, we brought the American people the good news and the bad news, and in the process became a part of the history of television and of journalism. I guess we and television grew up together. Well, now that part of it is over, and I believe Chet had every right to think that he had left the American people something useful, honest, and of permanent value. And for myself, the best I can do is say for one last time, good night, Chet.
On my part, along with everybody else around here, the news of Chet's death makes me very sad. He was quite a man. He had an unparalleled passion for life, off camera and on camera. What we will remember best, I think, is his extraordinary warmth. Chet Huntley will also be remembered as one of the most important people in 20th century journalism. When he and that fellow named Brinkley teamed up, television was beginning to cover the news. As television got better, Huntley and Brinkley got better. Here is how they began as a team at the 1956 political conventions.
The party of the people will nominate a candidate who will be the next President of the United States. Thank you, Mayor Daley.
Well, these, ladies and gentlemen, are the tidying up or the housekeeping processes, so to speak, getting a convention in order, getting it properly organized so that its main functions can be handled. Just a moment ago there, I might explain, you saw a couple of shots of Senator Smathers of Florida and one briefly of Mr. James Farley. I'm Chet Huntley, your host on behalf of NBC News for the complete convention coverage. Now, with me here in TV1, which is what we call our control studio for the conventions, are two gentlemen you know. David Brinkley, who will be reporting as he watches the proceedings with you, and Bill Henry, who will share the responsibility with David Brinkley and will summarize the many activities in and around this convention, which I might remark parenthetically, I am sure has established an all-time record for promptness and getting started on time. Perhaps, David, now you have some remarks to make, and come in with your observations, if you will.
Well, we are off to a flying start in many ways, Chet. I was a little staggered to see this convention start on time, and so were the delegates because they weren't here. I have one quick statistic which I think should go in the record book. It was 12:31:15 Chicago time when we first heard the words, "Will the delegates please take their seats?" And it was 12:32:15 Chicago time when we found that, as always, they did not.
That collaboration was to lead to one of the most successful television news operations of all time, which was centered on a program which began in October of 1956 called the Huntley-Brinkley Report.
Chet Huntley, NBC News, New York.
And David Brinkley, NBC News, Washington.
Israel today, I've sent this.
Personally, Chet Huntley was honest, hardworking, honorable, courageous, warm, patriotic, and decent. I think millions of people understood that. He was a superb reporter of straight news and a thoughtful commentator on the news. This is what he said, for example, when Martin Luther King was murdered.
This country and every person in it suffered a terrible loss tonight with the assassination of this man. Again, we are made to look like a nation of killers at a time when our detractors and unbridled critics and adversaries had already advanced that damaging assertion. The perpetrator of this deed brings down upon all of us the painful charge that we Americans are prisoners of violence and destruction and death. What others think we are, however, is less important than what we are. And we are poorer as a consequence of this, farther away from our national goals and more prey to complete disaster, the disaster described in such stark language in the recent report of the President's Commission on Civil Disorders. Dr. Martin Luther King is victim of the violence he preached against and eschewed. This stirring and gifted voice of restraint is now silent, and we will find it difficult to argue convincingly in behalf of moderation. That is the tragedy of it. Restraint, gentleness, charity, virtues we so desperately need, have had a dark day.
Chet Huntley did that kind of work for years, and here's the last thing he said on the program upon his retirement.
I want to thank the entire staff of NBC, for this nightly broadcast has not been an individual effort by any means. And as for you out there, I thank you first for your patience, then for your many kindnesses and the flattering things you have said and written. More difficult to take, to be sure, has been your criticism, but that too has been helpful and in most cases valid. But you have bolstered my conviction that this land contains an incredible quality and quantity of good common sense, and it's in no danger of being led down the primrose path by a journalist. At the risk of sounding presumptuous, I would say to all of you, be patient and have courage, for there will be better and happier news one day if we work at it.
I really don't want to say it, but the time has come, and so, for the last time, good luck and good night, Chet.
Good luck, David, and good night for NBC News.
And good night to you all from NBC News.